Okay, kia ora whānau, and welcome to today's designing. What is it? I can't even remember what I called the workshop. That's a good
Integrated learning design. Integrated learning design. Don't make something else up because I'm not sure what I'm here for otherwise.
Welcome everyone to the Integrated Learning Design webinar this afternoon. Thank you to everyone who has joined us today. Just a heads up that we will be recording this session and I will be sharing it back on the NCEA hackathon page. If you have any questions, I encourage you to use the chat part of the webinar, and I will be capturing those questions and we will have an opportunity to answer them later on. If just to ask anyone that is joining the webinar to keep their microphones on mute. And we will also be sharing with you the presentation that Di and Heemi are going to be using as the sort of the structure of the masterclass today. So once again, thank you to everyone for joining us, and a huge thank you to the fabulous Di Cavallo from Hobsonville Point Secondary School and Heemi McDonald, who's joining us from Rototuna Senior School. And you'll see that Di has also shared the link to the slides in the chat area, and but they'll also be presenting and talking to those slides throughout. So I am going to now hand over the controls to the fabulous Di and Heemi, and they're going to take you through a bit of a walk in the park through the processes, the strategies and the tools they use when designing integrated learning, because of course the integrated learning is an important part of preparing for using any kind of integrated assessment processes. So over to you two. Thank you.
Kia ora. Who's starting, Heemi?
Oh, kia ora. Kia ora e te whānau ko Heemi McDonald tōku ingoa no Ngāti Mutunga Hau. My name's Hugh Mcdonald. I am a Deputy Principal at Rototuna Senior High School, and currently one of my portfolios is dealing with the learning design aspect, in particular around subjects and courses. So that's my little brief blurb. Di, you want to do your little brief blurb?
Yeah, kia ora, ko Di Cavallo, taku ingoa. I'm Deputy Principal at Hobsonville Point Secondary School, and also, yeah, in charge of learning design there. And me and Heemi used to work together, so now we're in different places. We're back together but apart. Theme for today, together apart.
One of the ways in which we'll probably operate for the first part of our session together, or time together at least, is that Di and I will probably just talk off each other around some of the ideas that we had and some of the things we thought were important to consider, and then we would like to open it up to questions, and so if you've got those questions, definitely add them in, and perhaps we'll have some time to have some kōrero in there as well, so it's not just us talking at you. I will try and get the presentation working. There we go. Probably one of the first ports of call is that we'll be talking a bit about connected learning throughout the experience, and that's a purposeful choice of words, and largely thinking about the connotations that come with integrated learning, and also trying to see if we can open up some more thinking space in there. I would say that both Di and I, and I'm sure many of you all agree, that words matter, and the way in which we talk about things can have an impact on how they're received, or how they are developed, and how they continue through with that work. So we are really wanting to talk today about considering how might we better connect the learning at senior levels in particular. There will be implications for some of this mahi and how it can fit beyond those senior levels, so further down, but that's kind of probably one of our primary focus points. And also looking to see how we can share and build good practice. I think that's been one of the most amazing things about the hackathon so far, has been about that willingness and readiness for teachers to share and to build that common sense of good, best, next practice, and then also thinking about how we can maximize the recognition of learning experiences. So the first section we had talked about a little bit when Di and I got together and decided, hey, what are we going to cover? We thought there are probably three key aspects we'd like to go over. The first one is about principles. What are the principles underpinning perhaps some connected learning design from our perspective and from our experience? Then looking through to what processes and then what practices might be connected to some of those things. So we're hoping to give you some practical examples of how we've dealt with some of the connected learning design kaupapa in our experience and as we've seen through others. So just to get started, I was reading a book recently, Ray Dalio. I don't know if anyone knows Ray Dalio's book, really cool. But the one on the second or third page, it says, think for yourself. 1, decide what you want. 2, what is true. And 3, what you should do to achieve 1 and in light of 2. So I think when we're thinking back around what do we want, those principles, the principles become a fundamental part of how we start to design learning. So we've got the processes outlined here on the slides. We've got curriculum, progression, planning, professional learning, review and evaluation, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those things. But ultimately what it needs to come back to is what are some of those underlying principles around connectedness that we believe are important. So we put down some, and maybe Di wants to talk about some of these as well, as we talked about the importance of clarity, that connectedness should be about increasing clarity. We talked about coherence, so aligning learning experiences for both teachers and students, and that has some payoffs as well in terms of doing that. Really important principles around authenticity and connecting into our young people's lives, and then perhaps looking at the depth of learning. Di, do you want to just go over some of those aspects that we talked about?
I think, for both of us, I think this sort of kaupapa is really important, that it's more about the authenticity and the deeper learning that's going on rather than some sort of crazy credit grabbing exercise. So if that's what you're after, this is not the place for you. No one leaving? Cool. So, this is what it's all about.
I love it.
Too many people, I can't see them. I'm not judging. So you can see why there's a difference between looking for connections and this idea of connectedness than always talking about integration. So on the right-hand side is a very crude model that I adapted a few years ago from the SAMR model, if people remember that from the original sort of BYOD, starting to use more computers type stage of life. And this idea that, that we can make connections by doing that verbally, by saying, I know that in this learning area subject course, you're covering this, that links really well to this over here that we're doing. And that might be as far as you go, but you're already making some links and helping kids make sense and consolidate and amplify some of what they're doing. Next stage up, you're looking to really augment what you're doing by being a bit more deliberate and intentional about it. So that might be that we can find a partial shared context or some other thing that we have in common that enables us, in both those ways to enhance what the students are doing. The other half that gets that top half of fully transformational is where you might see space for full integration or partial integration, where we can create one learning experience or one learning opportunity or activity or multiple activities, but where they're absolutely integrated. We might also be able to find a way of having an integrated task, or we might need to divide off and have separate tasks. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Or to the level at the top, which is kind of perhaps the holy grail, but not necessarily all the time, and sometimes happens when it's really appropriate, that we can really redefine what something looks like, because it's so seamless that the students almost have to ask you, well, is this the English part or the science part or the history part? I can't tell, because they're so dovetailed together. And that's when we know we've found a very strong connection. But all of those levels of connection are just as valid. So it's not always about integration. So that's probably an explanation, I suppose, of why we choose to talk about connections and connectedness rather than always talking about integration. So that people realise there's a whole range of ways you can do this well.
And it's an easy access point, isn't it, Di, around being able to help people to see possibilities. This could connect to this thing, or this could connect to this thing, or this standard connects to this standard in this particular way. Whereas in many situations it might be quite daunting to talk about integration straight up with a team of teachers to say, I need you to integrate these two standards so that we can do it a bit better or be a bit more streamlined in how we're approaching something.
And some of the ways we can talk about that is, you know, even starting lower down the school, is just around the jargon that we all have. We love this in secondary because it's how we sort of protect our little empires of expertise and specialist knowledge. So an example for me teaching design is always that we talk about scale. In maths, you talk about ratio. In science, you probably talk about gradients. In food, you mix up different proportions of ingredients, and they're all the same concept. We just use different words to describe them because they've got some distinctions. So when we take that idea of making connections verbally and building on that, those are ways that we can, you know, really start to go deeper. And obviously, as you get up to those senior levels, that can look really authentic in terms of the learning and how much we add extra layers in for the students.
And then I think that just adding on to that as well is those principles actually help to pull the work back into the sustainable practice area, I think, in terms of, are we doing this because of, are we on the right track? How do we know we're on the right track? And what impact is it having for our learners or the design at the outset? I think we just had a question or a statement. In the current level of perception, reporting, etc., that can be an issue. Which part of history or which part of maths, etc.? Yeah, and I think that's perhaps, if I'm understanding that question right, Cindy, is, you know, what's most important needs to be part of the conversation, and then who is it most important to, and how do we ensure that our systems or the way in which we design learning experiences are guided by those principles at the outset? Because if we can keep going back to those things around, is this clear? Is this providing clarity? Is it providing a depth of learning? We have one at our kura that talks about powerful learning. So is learning powerful? How do we know it's powerful? And then we've got that lens through which we can go back and critique our own practice, as well as looking at how the integration or the connection of standards or subjects or whatever it is actually meeting our purpose, our why did we decide to do this in the first place? What's our why kind of kōrero. So I think that's those are a good question there, Cindy. Should we move through that? So principles help to give us some clarity and provide us a place to go back to. That next stage that we talked about was really around the ways in which we might connect and the connection methods. And perhaps, Di, you want to talk a little bit about some of those phases that we saw in terms of connections. So this is probably more the lived experience of the kids and the teachers on a day-to-day.
Yeah, this is us really thinking about the different ways we do it. And I think Hemi's right. The initial questions in your process is always around, what's the point? You know, what's the so what here? What are we trying to achieve? And what's the powerful, significant learning? Different ways you can do it. And, you know, this was just talking through exactly what we're doing in our kura right now. Sometimes we're retrofitting. So I think probably most people are quite familiar with this. We talked about a slightly cynical example, what happens at the end of the year in a lot of schools where suddenly you get a lot of pressure to suddenly find some extra credits for kids. Anyone familiar with that one? And so we're suddenly scratching around to see what else we can add on or add in or connect to. And so I think we want to move away from that, but say there's positive ways to do the retrofitting. It's really that looking for benevolent links. So things that you've already planned, you didn't plan it necessarily intentionally to connect to something else. But what you sort of discover on the way is that actually this connects quite well to the standard that you've got over there in your learning area. And let me understand a bit better, a bit more specifically what's required for that criteria. And I need to make sure I've got the right person with the expertise who is either going to help me to very clearly understand that criteria, or who might be open to helping me mark it, verify it, critique tasks, etc. So examples of this might be that the students may have already started, like, you know, this is discussions we were having last week online with all our level 2 teachers and all our level 3 teachers is what have we already got that students are already working on, or I don't think people have completed much at this point, but they're already halfway through. But actually what we've realized, there's some really fortunate connections to other things that we can now try and leverage. So for example, lots of people do report writing. When we start to look at what's required for report writing for English, for example, that in science, the students would need to add an abstract, because that gives you the sense of purpose that's required for English. And I'm not an English specialist, so someone else might have more detail on that. But so understanding that, okay, if I've already got to write a report, could I somehow leverage that somewhere else by making a few tweaks because I need to meet the criteria for the other thing? So things we're looking at is our English team don't currently use the visual text standard. So we're looking at students from drama, dance, visual arts, all using work that's already planned. So visual arts boards, performances, I think, from dance and drama that could be used to meet the visual arts, English visual text criteria, if we're very specifically understanding what those things are. And the same with oral text. People in technology is doing the same thing. So working with the English team, and when we're back on site next week, we'll be having some sessions where we get the right people in the room who all think they could link into that standard, and we'll have a shared understanding of that, and saying we'll find those things that are in common, like report writing, and say let's understand the criteria.
And I think this is one of those important moments to recognise that this is not, we definitely don't think these are good, bad, or otherwise. These are just ways in which we recognise that we operate, and how we can probably get the most of those opportunities. Like, we moved into a house recently, and I got that house, and when I took my new buyer's goggles off, I realised there was a lot of work that needed to be done in the house that I didn't see when I first bought it. So then I had to get perhaps some expertise or support to come in and help me to build a fence over the holidays. It's not holidays, I've been working, just saying. Over the lockdown, built a fence. That required me to actually take in some of those, to take in the current surroundings, to adjust to those surroundings, and then to get some expertise to help me to do something new with that same blank canvas or that same canvas. And it's the same that happens for our kids often towards the end of the year. You've completed these standards. Hey, look, we know that this links well with these other things. Let's see if we can find some opportunity here for you to continue to craft your work that meets the needs of the other standards. Now, what we're probably talking about here, Di, from on the same train, is that we can probably better prepare for those if we know that we're going to go to those experiences, and perhaps we can start thinking about how are we going to make those more purposeful experiences as opposed to hopeful or just in time or just in case kind of experiences. Maybe we can actually start thinking about, are there times in the year, like art is probably a really good example, where the body of work tends to come towards the end of the year, the final product kind of stuff. And if you were starting to look at how that might connect with other standards, that's when perhaps some of the more substantial work might be available to look at and to start to thinking about crafting. So there might be just purposeful times that we choose and place that retrofitting experience into our experience as teachers and working with our students.
Yeah, and we would hope, I think, I know what we're thinking about is hoping that some of the stuff that this year might be retrofitting, next year might move into the middle band where we've sort of done a bit more pre-planning. So if we move to that one, so the first one's got the Pac-Man. So basically Pac-Man's going around and eating up as many things as he can. You show your age if you know what I'm talking about. Middle one is a bit more sort of like, it's already happening. We're already doing this work, and in the process of having some conversations, we realized that actually this thing that we're about to teach, or we may have just started, we could make it a whole heap better if we use this connection that we've just discovered. And I've put a couple of examples on there. These might come from teacher conversations. These might come from student bringing a context to you and saying, hey, actually, Lisa, I'm looking at this thing over here. Could I use that here? because I'm doing this context over here, it'd be really cool. I think it could link. So, and often students think about those things and have some quite good conversations around that. So that's a way that you can really deepen the outcomes. And there's a couple of really good examples here. I don't know if any of our crew, Andrea or Danielle, here. I don't think so. Anyway, sing out if anyone's here who's actually been involved in these that could talk in more detail. But a couple of really good ones that have happened for us. Last year was a level 3 student who, you know, hands up, she's slightly out of the box, like she is a New Zealand elite performance athlete in field events. So she's like not your average Joe. But what she realised was in biology, we have to do this assignment where we need to look at the effect of some kind of supplement on, I don't know if it had to be the blood, but that's what she was looking at. And what she realised she could do with this was to link it to her performance athlete world of training and to her phys ed work around the idea that you develop some sort of training program and you evaluate the outcomes of that. So she linked all of these things together to create some work where she looked at the effect of creatine supplements on performance. And, you know, this knowledge is actually quite new. So this is useful to a lot of people beyond her. It's not something that anyone's looked at before. So in the outcome that really came from her initiative of, this sounds really cool to me, I'd like to look at this and this, was some very powerful learning. And that linked across at least 2 areas for her. Another one that's happened this year is really just conversations between teachers, and at level 2, biology teacher and geography teacher now aligning their courses to be around the concepts of Cody dieback. And for both of them, not that they haven't got all of the students in common, but that doesn't matter because there's a bunch of students who are in common. So for some of those students, they already have got this much deeper understanding that they bring from the other area of how to look at this sort of socio-scientific issue, and from a geographic standpoint of understanding this Cody dieback issue. And so that for them has created much deeper learning. So this kind of stuff that happens during or just at the beginning of some teaching, or the context that the students bring. So this can happen in lots of ways. We have had cases where you might have students in common, so you get 2 or 3 people you know. For example, we had 2 or 3 years ago quite a largish, for us, group of students who were all interested in going on to engineering or architecture school. So what we did was get the DVC tech teacher, the physics teacher, the calc teacher together. All of those students were all doing all 3 of those things, and most of them also doing English. So just by having conversations with those teachers together, we didn't come up with something fully integrated, but what they were all able to do was slightly shift their context to be relevant to those pathways. So that's another way in, is either around student brings out their own interest as a context, they bring a context from of something they know they're covering in a different area, or you perhaps do some quite proactive planning around different types of pathways that you know you've got single or multiple students interested in, or you allow them to bring very personalized contexts and then streamline around those things.
And sometimes that streamlining comes through the kids, doesn't it, in terms of the experience that they're having, and they're saying, oh, I recognize it's not just directed and led by the teachers, you know, that the students often will come to a teacher and say, oh, I'm doing this in maths, I'm doing this in science, or I'm doing this in English or art or technology. Can these work together? So that it doesn't always have to be instigated by the teacher, but sometimes that streamlining and hopefully increasingly it becomes something that students are able to discuss and to openly pursue as well. I think the question there, probably just to take a moment in that die, is to say, does moving into COVID level 2 provide an opportunity to work early on retrofitting and integrated assessments? Absolutely. Like, I think the purpose here, and I think one of the amazing things about the hackathon is the obvious willingness and readiness for teachers to be able to look for ways in which to reduce the stress and the pressure on our young people, and to help them to have a more positive experience around assessment. Because it's not about avoiding assessment, and it's not about making it easier necessarily, but it's about streamlining those experiences and going back to the principles around providing clarity and coherence, and not having this hodgepodge mishmash of experience for our young people. We know that we can find those connections perhaps more easily in as teachers, and maybe that's our avenue in, and that's where the retrofitting now might come. Go back to school when you've got your kids on site, you might have some time, and it all is going to be dependent on school structures and how change management is, and what the community needs are. I mean that by the school community. So lots of those are going to be different. It's all going to be different depending on your situation. But perhaps bringing those kids together, or bringing teachers together, and just having, I think there's real power in corridor as the first step, is to say, can we at least hear from one another and understand the experiences from one another's perspectives, and also from the perspective of our young people, and then how can we build on those things? So I think there's some opportunities in there.
And that's certainly why we've started. I mean, I suppose you're always retrofitting a little bit in some places, and usually we wait until there's kind of a little bit of a desperate need for individual students, often, or a group of students who haven't quite got this criteria met, or they haven't quite got enough credits over here. So yeah, I would agree with who said that? Sorry, Grant. Yes, we are retrofitting right now, and this is why we've kind of come up with these 3 different ways of describing them. It's the ones that are happening at any point in time after you planned the course, I suppose. That's retrofitting. So at the beginning of the course, I didn't plan, or that our visual arts people didn't plan to perhaps try and address the visual text or oral text standards, but now they're having those conversations. And from next year, if that works this year, then that would move into sort of being streamlined and actually built into the course, you would hope, rather than an afterthought. So anything that comes after your original planning, I suppose, fits into that category. And then the last one really around the integrated is that a bit more fully integrated. You've co-designed that from the outset with somebody else or with multiple other people. Potentially, again, it could have been planned to integrate around a group of students' pathway, wishes, or particular needs, or it could be across different learning areas to create more of a course, more of an integrated course. And one example I've given there that we've got at the moment is level 2 food, tech and business studies, where really this has come out of actually both learning areas teaching separately, but actually around the same context in the past, and saying we've got a different way of doing it. We've actually tried before with food, tech and horticulture. And so it was this idea of from garden to table. That had some success. And this year, different combination. So co-designed, co-taught, 2 teachers are in the same space, and they figure out how best to do that relationship. And this year it's working very strongly around the idea of future food.
I was just thinking, there's a question there that popped up from Nicole about whether you'd recommend teachers trialling one integrated task first, or would you go to a whole course first time out? I mean, I think from my experience at Hobsonville Point, and you guys can add to this, there's no one right way of doing it. If you see an opportunity for a single integrated part of a module or a course, absolutely go for it. But at the same time, I don't think people should shy away from entire integrated courses and giving it a go. There's not a hell of a lot to lose. I mean, we know from the early days at Hobsonville Point Secondary School that we designed some fully integrated courses that didn't work, and there will be some where the connections don't end up working as well as they do for a number of reasons. So I would encourage people to not feel like there's one correct way of doing this.
Yeah, and I think that's what we wanted to talk about today, and that's why we've tried to sort of give these 3 types of ways that you can find connections, because they're all quite different and they're all relevant when they're appropriate. I don't know that I could answer the question of what's the timeline. If you're talking about a fully integrated program, you'd probably be wanting to think about that in July for 2021, but that would depend on your own school's whether you have to go and pitch it somewhere and get approval and all of those kind of things, that different schools do that differently. I certainly think it's worth trialling one unit. I know there have been some highly successful ideas, like you're talking about a whole course about Health Academy. I would say I know Jane Dunbar, who's at our school but came from Papakura, where she started up their whole Health Academy type class, or Health Sciences Academy.
And Sports and Z have got a whole dedicated website to that as well.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of there are quite a lot of good examples and people with a lot of specific knowledge around that particular question about Health Sciences, Health Academy. There's a few schools doing that very well. We're not one of those, but I know Jane Dunbar and Sport New Zealand would be places to go for information about that. If you're talking about really a whole kind of course to that level, you'd want to start planning and perhaps having a chat to people who have been doing those particular ones. What we do is do this kind of connection and integration from year 9 up, so kids are very used to it, and by the time they get to senior level, they're so used to the idea of connecting knowledge and learning that they start to find the connections themselves and bring them to you. And I suppose that's what we've set out to do.
And I think one of
Sorry,
I was just going to add in there, Di, I think one of the amazing things about teachers is that they're really resilient and keen to trial things. And I haven't met many schools that don't have teachers who are willing to trial some stuff. I think that in many cases, it's our own systems or rules that schools set that prevent those things from occurring. So if on a small scale, you could get a couple of teachers together without having a whole systemic change, because you might not be able to manage that, or that might not be possible this year, or that's something else out of my control. I think it's finding those people and looking to work within those areas of control first, and then moving, so sometimes spreading that work, because I think in some cases there's almost a fear of doing it because I'm going to break the rules that our school has set. It's not that it's not possible, and sometimes we just need to open up those, or remind people that, hey, go ahead. I know every teacher that's delivering NCEA, I hope and think, wants to see the best outcome for their kids. And so it's not about, sometimes the rhetoric is around, you're just guinea pigs or trying to trial this crazy fandangled new thing on the kids. It's actually about trying to make it better, and trying to go back to those big why principles around clarity, coherence, or whatever yours might be, deep, powerful learning. So I think it's starting. Sometimes it is just starting, depending on your context. If you don't have the ability to change a whole system and you're not in that position, then it's starting where you can. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again, teachers can get away with a lot in their own classrooms before anyone asks any questions. I don't mean that for everyone to go out and undermine their schools. It's actually that there's a lot of autonomy in teaching already, which just sometimes we feel a little bit closed off to be able to exercise that autonomy. So I think there are opportunities.
Yeah.
We
do.
Don't ask and share.
We did that initiative a few years back. Actually, it was probably many years back now, the Hack the Classroom idea, and that idea that you have a lot of flexibility with your own classroom. I thought someone asked a good question there, and it touched on some of the learning that we did at Hobsonville Point Secondary School, when they said, are there some subjects that are too pure? The knowledge is too pure for them to be integrated effectively. And I think we learned that if you put two real skills-based subjects together, sometimes you didn't, the product curdled a little bit. For example, when we tried to do English maths combinations, it wasn't the most natural fit in the world, and wasn't the most successful, because both maths and English lent themselves to be combined with another subject that provided the context for applying the skills of maths, or the skill set of that comes out of English. So I think it is about spending some time to seek out natural connections rather than forcing combinations of two learning areas or subjects. And I know we found that a number of times, didn't we? But at the same time, don't limit yourself thinking that, English and social sciences go well together, let's just lump them together all the time as well. Like, I think you can shortchange yourself similarly if you go to what you think are the like subjects.
Because I think we've seen a few, some of our learning, and I think there's a couple of things in there to answer a couple of those comments people have made. One is it's got to come from that why. Someone said, how do you start changing people's sort of rationale behind it, not just credit farming, is it's about deeper, authentically connected learning, and that's good for everybody. So it gives us either a context to work with that's more meaty. It's not, oh, we've got to do a speech. Well, what topic should I pick for my speech? Or you bring the knowledge that you're learning somewhere else to deepen what you're doing over here, and you're amplifying each other. And so it's got to come from that why of deeper, authentic learning. And a byproduct of that is that benevolent, maximizing the recognition of learning by gathering some extra credits, by doing less better or working smarter. I think other things we learn is be careful about making judgments about different subjects. There will be any level 3 physics fans here, because those are the people who always want to say, well, I don't think my subject can mix because it's just too pure. We've definitely found that not to be the case. It fits very well with anything to do with tech, engineering, calculus, but physics and music have worked well together. Maths and music have worked well together. So sometimes those ones that people don't think are obvious. And I think what happens, there are some things I agree with Claire, and this is why what Heemi said, and I think we've got it probably on the next slide, is talking about the process of finding those connections, is that you've got to really know your big ideas, know your significant learning, what's the powerful learning. So what are the big ideas, the concepts in your area, in your course, in your subject, in your standards? What's the skills, capabilities? What are some of the contexts that might be fixed? So some people have to do New Zealand based, some people have to do New Zealand and beyond, some people have to look at past, present, future. You know, there are some of those things that are must-dos in your learning areas. Other people are much more open in terms of contexts, and then you might pick very topical context that gives something that's really current, that's a bit relevant for students. But you've got to know what all that stuff is, and you've got to know your own specific criteria. And those are the places that you're going to find the connections. And so when we really understand that significant learning, and we understand, and we've done the work of knowing what our big ideas are, not this is the course that I've been teaching for the last 10 years, so I'm just going to press repeat. But that's where those are the places where we're going to find the overlaps and the connections. And sometimes we can be surprised at how well subjects that we may have thought wouldn't fit together well have worked very well, and others we've been surprised haven't worked as well as we anticipated.
And Morgan he asked, how do we include whānau and community in the process? Do you want to talk a little bit about how we've, at Hobsonville, we pulled on student voice to come up with concepts and ideas as well? That may be something you touch on later in the presentation, is it? Yeah.
Well, we'll definitely get to that, I think, a little bit more. I just wanted to say, I think sometimes the conversation, we just need a shift from what we have been discussing about in terms of specialized subjects and knowledges and whose knowledge is important and all of that kind of stuff. Sometimes that, I think, is unproductive and is the wrong conversation to have. If we can switch the conversation around, like what Di has been talking about around significant learning, like what is your significant learning? Can you name it? Can you say it in a way that kids understand? Can you say it in a way that whānau understand? Can we understand why it needs to be delivered in this particular way? Then you're starting to open up the opportunity for connections. I think sometimes the conversations can be quite limiting in terms of, well, this is how we delivered the course, and this is why we deliver the course this way, but we haven't actually gone back to the fundamental building block knowledge that you're trying to get to. Because what we've probably found in hearing from you and other schools and probably looking through that is that there is perhaps some generic capabilities and skills which are transferable quite easily, and then there might be some discipline-specific skills or capabilities that are better developed in isolation or in smaller segments or in how those things are. But unless we know that stuff, we're not talking about it, and we're not then being able to find those connections across the learning experiences for our kids. And then I think bringing that back to our whānau, I think it comes down to is whose knowledge is important and what knowledge is important, and how do we know what's important knowledge for our whānau and powerful for them to know and understand, and honouring some of that mahi and how do we bring that into the learning experience. So I think there's a place there for that as well.
Yeah, a couple of comments that are on there or questions. I think another reason why we talk about the sort of cooperative connection rather than fully integrated is because there are some things that need to be discretely taught. So even, I mean, in our kura, if you're in a co-module and you've co-planned and you're co-teaching with someone, that doesn't mean everything's integrated. It might mean that Heemi and I are teaching together, but there's a time when he needs to take off a group, or he'll take off small groups one at a time, and he needs to give this new learning. There's this thing that needs to be taught in isolation. You need this discrete little small body of knowledge at this point. And some of the things would fit well and some of the things don't. So we're certainly not in the business of trying to force any kind of connections. You know, sometimes it's a bit trial and error when you're trying things for the first time. But yeah, our students we try and unpack for the students, this is just answering someone else's question, where those things connect.
Di, I like your analogy that you've often used in the past, where you have the diagram of the two circles, and that it's totally okay that within any one module you might, if the two circles represent each subject being taught or learning area, that at times they will exist side by side, at times they will just overlap ever so slightly, overlap more, or they may disappear on top of one another for fully integrated. And actually all of those phases and stages are just as relevant depending on what it is that you're trying to teach and reinforce.
I'd just add to that, Claire, you know, when we've just done some work recently to revisit what we meant by connectedness, and that's we'll add that particular image into the slide deck, Di, after this.
I'm just trying to find it.
But what do I think, coming back to what schools mean by connectedness, and sometimes I think we get a little bit caught up that collaborative practice is connectedness, but if our kids can't walk away from that experience understanding how they've connected their learning, why they've connected the learning, what skills or capabilities they've actually connected together, then perhaps it's not really connectedness. And is it connected to themselves as individuals, and to their whānau, and to the knowledge that they think is important and valuable, in all of those parts? So we've had to take some time as a school to do a stock take and to step back a little bit and say, it's not just about the way in which we're teaching and delivering, because that's about the teachers. It's also about helping our young people to be able to articulate those connections and recognize that that's what's happening for them and with them and to them.
And it's important to acknowledge what this looks like in different contexts as well, because obviously if we've got the privilege of, you know, Rototuna, Hobsonville, Albany Senior, we've got that sort of advantage of open plan spaces. So it is a viable idea to have 45 kids in one room and be co-teaching. Yet, you know, it's absolutely still possible to do this in single cell classrooms, but it just might be designed in quite a different way, where it relies on connections being sought across. You know, you might let kids, you might get them to choose two lines that they go into side by side, so that you know you've got the same cohort of students in level 2 physics as you have in level 2 music or whatever. You know, there are still potential possibilities to do this, even if you're not teaching them as a smushed together group of students.
For example, we have physics and calculus working together at level 2. But I think someone else asked this question about, can you have students doing different things? And yes, every single student is doing their own inquiry in there, and every student, it's all personalised. So they're all linking their calc physics experiments, I don't know what they call it, inquiry experiments, into something else that is of interest to them or to their pathway. So they are all doing something different, slightly different, with lots of the same learning wrapped up inside there.
And sometimes the connections, and I think that was one of the questions that was asked, sometimes the connections are harder to make than others. And that's an acknowledgement of different knowledge and disciplinary knowledge and how those things intersect with each other. So it's not always as straightforward as we might like it to be, and it's okay. We need to acknowledge perhaps the fuzziness of that experience, is that not everything is easily connected to everything else. But yeah, sorry, Claire, go.
No, all I was going to say, Heemi, is it the same at Rototuna as it was, and I'm presuming it's still this at Hobsonville Point Secondary School. Obviously, it's been nearly 2 years since I've been there, so things may have changed. But I know when I left that we had, at year 11, we had students going through 2 integrated modules, so 2 sets of 2 subjects combined and taught alongside each other. In year 12, we went to 1 integrated module and the remainders were single subjects. And for the sake of choice and selection at year 13. They went towards single subjects, but there were still opportunities to seek connections across those subjects. Is that still the case, Di?
Yeah, and the reason for that, though, is not necessarily that we can't find connections, but it would basically restrict student choice too much. So what we do instead, and I think some of the things we've put on as screenshots for you on the slides that are from Hobsonville Point from last week, we had some connections, Hui, Zooey. So yeah, what we've basically done is make some matrices. Is that correct, mathematicians? So what you can see, we've got basically a big Google Sheet spreadsheet where we've got Q2, that's Quals 2 for us, which is like level 2 courses, where each learning area or course has captured that significant learning stuff. What is it that sits inside, so that I can have a look through, or anyone else can look across and say, oh, that's a couple of things there that I could connect to. And this is kind of for us in terms of this retrofitting, but obviously lots more conversations coming out. So whilst we have some co-teaching modules at all levels of our school except level 3, what we do instead is try and find connections either for individual students or with between learning areas just through Korero and Hui, really. So we've got one page where people have tried to capture very succinctly what some of the big ideas, significant learning, specific requirements that you have in your course, so that I can try and discover some of those benevolent links. And then we've got another page, I think we've put it on the next slide, where we've got all the learning area courses down one side and across the top. So you go across on the across line, if you're the business teacher and you say, oh, in business, I think I could link to English here because I do this. I think I possibly could link to tech over here. I think there might be a way here that I could link to Digi Tech. And you put in all the things that you either already know about for sure, or you think where there could be something worth a further conversation. And so if I'm the English is getting smashed because they're so generic in the language, through the language, by the language, the English people can look down the column which says English, and they can see all the different connections that other people think they might have to English. And now they'll have more conversations, or we'll pick out the ones that are reoccurring, like report writing, for example. Like we'll get all the people who think they could do visual text in a room, and we'll talk specifically with the English experts about what the criteria are for that and whether it's a possibility, who it's going to work for, how we're going to do that, the logistics. Because the real key here, so that your PN is not starting to have kittens, is that you must also have that robust quality assurance stuff going on. So you've still got to go through process. You know, someone's got to want to do the mahi of the meeting the rigor and having assessment schedules and all of that stuff, so that you still, it's not just, oh, that looks cool, I think I'll give someone some credits for that thing, but someone's got to be willing to have the conversations and do the work around making sure that that meets your rigorous quality assurance requirements, just like everything else.
Just so I can clarify, so would you see, like say you've got the first column down as chemistry, would that be like the chemistry teachers putting in what they think were the links were, and then the English teachers? No,
the other way around.
So the other way around.
If you go across, so the rows that go crossways is, so if I was the biology teacher, I've gone across. Sorry, it's so small I can't see it on here. I've gone across, if I'm the bio teacher, and said, this is where I think I've got some links.
Oh, the potential links, yeah.
I think bio to chemistry.
So the one that I've made big so you can read it, the dance teacher with English, so you've got two screenshots on there, the slightly bigger one that you can probably read and the other one you need glasses for. The business teacher is saying, I think we could link to evidence for writing portfolio because we write marketing plans, we do evidence for oral text because we do a business pitch. The English teacher is going to have a conversation there and say, well, this is the requirements for oral text, and there's lots of people who think they might link into oral text.
So this I could see this being a particularly powerful approach for this year for teachers.
Well, this is literally what we've created last week. So last week we had online Hui with all the level 2 teachers and a separate one with all the level 3 teachers, some of whom are already co-teaching. So for example, food and business are already working together. Bio and Geo already had this context of coded back in common, which they've already been planning and working on. And some people had some other things. And then other people had all these other ideas of, well, actually, I think possibly we could link here and we could do that retrofitting with this one. So what we will do is run some workshops with experts from English around visual text. To anyone who thinks they might be able to link to that, come and find out for sure. Anyone who thinks they might link to oral text, come and find out for sure. Anyone who thinks they might be able to make a digital, I've forgotten the wording in digital product, I think. Anyone who makes websites, but they can't be on Wix or WordPress, it's got to be fully coded. So but if you go above and beyond and you think, or you've got some kids in common who might be able to do that. So, yeah, and we just to make sure people realise, because I don't know what you know about our school, but we do this connected stuff from year 9. So we do, someone's talking about speed dating. We do speed dating with year 9 teachers, year 10 teachers, all the way through to find our pairings earlier on. This is a little bit different for us at this point because it's a bit more retrofitting, but looking forwards as well, saying, hey, we can really see these are some things we would build in for next year's courses rather than retrofitting some of these where they work. So knowing that with a science report, if I have, and I'm sure it's a little bit more than just writing an abstract, but I can meet some English criteria. What would that be for? Who's the English? Lisa? Claire? If I've written a science report, is that writing portfolio?
Yeah, writing portfolio.
But I need to have added an abstract, which I didn't need for the science, but if I add an abstract,
yeah, so it's being aware that to
purpose.
meet the standard, the actual conditions of assessment and the they need to rework something.
Yeah, and we're being really careful though that there will be lots of conversations and little sub-team meetings with the people who are the experts. It's not just me going, oh, that English one looks easy, I think I'll grab that and give it a whirl. That's not what we're talking about. And I saw there was a question there about people credit farming or standard grabbing. People do get a little bit protective about these things. So you do have to make sure, like for us, visual text, there's no issues because English don't use it in their current programs. It might not be so easy in your school because the English department might already have that as part of a few courses. So you'd have to check that you weren't doubling up with crossover students.
But I think also you need to talk to the student and see which context serves the student better. So if they're absolutely passionate about science and lukewarm on English, to say that we're going to protect English as the space that they have to do it in another pure context when we could take their science writing, which they're passionate about, and rework. Why wouldn't you? It's like I think we've got to make sure we always come back to, if we put on the hat that we're serving the students and looking for the best way for them to, evidence their best work. Like I would always, as an English teacher, as a matter of course, if I had students struggling to get their writing portfolio done or struggling to get their wide reading done, I think it's your responsibility as that subject teacher to go beyond your subject and ask them what are they doing beyond your subject that floats their boat and they can use to, because that doesn't, like, we're always talking. Yeah, it's about being smarter. Yes, absolutely.
I think that's
Hillary.
that real streamlining / integrated mode where you're really finding context, because either I've had a conversation in the staff room with someone else and we've discovered, hey, actually we've got this thing in common, or because you can talk to the students about what they're doing, what they're interested in, and they've got context they can bring from other places. There's just, lots of different ways to do it.
And then for teachers, that requires, I think, that dialogue and that communication about what is important and what is actually the significant learning here. And if you can have that conversation in connection with the standards that you might be delivering with the kids, then perhaps those connections become easier to form and become more natural over time. Because in a retrofitting phase, you're always kind of looking backwards, trying to just fix up a situation perhaps, whereas purposeful design and integration or learning design requires us to look forward and to iterate and to develop as we go. So some of those positions are okay to be in for now. What's our next step? How do we move forward with this? How do we increase the capacity of our young people to bring their own context to learning, and for us to be able to unpack and articulate what the significant learning is here? How does that resonate across your learning program? So perhaps it's moving from that teacher-centric organisation of time within a school to those teachers become available to the students based on the context that they're bringing. And I know COVID has thrown that into the mix for us at the senior high school as well. And we have all of our year 11 and 12 students have co-taught modules, and we introduced that for level 3 courses as well. But what we kept coming back to was, what is connectedness? What do we mean by it? How are we achieving that? How are we achieving those integrated assessment outcomes? And what's our next iteration and what's our next step in that? Because COVID has thrown up a lot of insights and possibilities, I think, for everybody, I imagine, around the potential for our young people to actually manage their own learning, and also perhaps the ways in which they're engaging with learning experiences, either online or not, and the equity issues within our system as well, and some of those things that have come up. So I think there's some real possibilities that have popped out, and perhaps that's...
Okay, you're looking at the last couple of minutes, people. Our time is nearly up. So tell us your whiz-banger top tips.
I don't
know if there's any more slides.
It's definitely coming back to that purpose of deeper, authentic learning and genuine connection.
Oh, talk about the fact that you've got your templates. Just explain what those are.
Just some planning templates for you. Some free stuff.
So that one before, can you go back one, Hemi? There are a couple of real, so that's the food and business studies. You can just see how we plan. That's just a real first page of the planning overview. And then people have these shared planning documents. Those are both modules for us that have been co-planned and co-taught. One on the left is a couple of years old because that was when Hemi was with us. Psychology, history and English together. The one on the right is food tech and business studies. Just so you can see. And then on the last page, you've got a couple of empty templates on there, and it should be the connectedness. I might have to reshare the slide link because I've put that other... can you see the circles on there, Hemi? On the last slide or not?
But we'll make sure we update that.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll share it back with the video of this session as well.
The other thing I would just add there is that we've got quite a lot of things we can share. We just don't know what's relevant, and sometimes it's just easier for people to post up something in the hackathon, say, has anyone got something around this? And definitely use the integrated learning design thread, and we can always post resources and share resources that way as well, because we don't know what sometimes will be helpful.
So yeah, it's what that someone said, is this integrated assessment, would you normally go from specific learning outcomes? Personally, that wouldn't be my starting point. My starting point is definitely around the big ideas and understanding significant learning. So either what's the biggest things for you? Is it conceptual? So someone else like Claire could bring the English skill set to craft good quality writing or link it into literature. Is it something like psychology and English that link very strongly together and can be quite closely integrated? Are you more of a skill-based? So there are a lot of different learning areas. Some are very conceptual. Social science brings a lot of concepts. Science brings lots of concepts and capabilities. Other things are a bit more skills, and we just sort of repeat the skills over and over and get better at them, so we can link with lots of things. You all know the expertise in your own area, so really it's got to be the starting point of the good ideas for connections.
Can I make a real plug, and it's something that I know we did a lot at Hobsonville in the early days, is that everyone goes back to the New Zealand curriculum documentation, because so often we see teachers, particularly in the senior space, working from achievement standards as if those represent the learning outcomes or the strands of the curriculum for each learning area. Of course, they do have a relationship because that's the whole point of them. They assess aspects of each subject. But I think the more you know the actual wording of your learning area and the achievement, the step up of the achievement objectives, and the more you understand the threshold concepts, skills, etc. for each learning area, the more you're actually able to play, in my mind.
And some people's learning areas have that really clear in the curriculum document. Other people's don't. We've had to do a lot of work to try and extrapolate what the big ideas are, the concepts are, what the real key threshold concepts are in your area, and what those skills, capabilities. And people can be teaching for a long time and find it quite hard to articulate that stuff, but it's really valuable work that's worth doing with your teachers.
Definitely one of those strategies.
And sharing that so people get their head around what the big ideas are in other people's areas, not necessarily that you're going to teach them, but knowing where those avenues for possible connection lie is really valuable.
Yeah, and I think, staff making time to do those crisscross and the intersection of concepts and ideas and their subjects is really powerful for any school to do.
It's easy starter.
Yeah.
It's an easy place to start. Do a deep dive into your curriculum area.
Okay, thank you, team. I'm going to round us up there because I'm aware that I want people to be able to keep to the time frame. Massive thank you to Heemi and Di, who I just shanghaied last week and basically told them they were doing a masterclass. Because that's how I roll. These guys have worked with me. They know what I'm about. And then usually, it's like when I sign them up for special things, they die, and then I ditch it at the last minute.
I have a canned response for Claire. Yes.
I think we'll lose all these messages on here once the meeting ends. So if you've got any other messages, just to do it through the Facebook process. I think someone said, are you happy to share the high-end planning on the big ideas? Does someone mean all of the work we did to deconstruct the New Zealand curriculum? Yes,
we can see some planning documents.
Spreadsheets, so maybe email me for that.
Yeah, and definitely it's actually that the wealth of the learning came from the process of actually going through the process of unpacking. So someone's unpacked version isn't necessarily as useful either. Awesome. Thank you to everyone who's come along. We will share the recorded version of this webinar back on the NCEA Hackathon, and we will also share the PowerPoint. Thanks again, and I will stick around with Di and Heemi for a moment. We'll just make sure that we've got all those questions. So thank you, everyone. Have a fantastic Tuesday evening. Remember, there is a show and tell session available tomorrow at 4 p.m. as well. So hopefully see some of you there as well. Thanks, team. See you later.
See ya.
Ka kite.
Watching people peel away.
Yeah, they're disappearing off the numbers are dropping.
Hurry up, it's gin o'clock.
Just going to stop recording now.